Hello, welcome, and thank you for being part of Victoria's Economic Transformation Impact on Workplace Safety webinar. My name is Cameron Lang, and I'll be your host for this session. Today, I'm joined by Narelle Beer, Executive Director, Health and Safety, WorkSafe Victoria. Good morning, Narelle.
Hi, Cameron. Good to see you again.
It's great to see you too. Thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward to your presentation. Now, at the end of Narelle's presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions. You'll see the Q&A box on your screen, so you can start putting your questions in whenever you like, and I will ask those questions on your behalf at the end of Narelle's presentation. As I said, start entering, and whenever you want throughout Narelle's presentation, we'll have them ready to go. But let's get started. Today, we are going to discuss how Victoria's economic transformation has affected the employment landscape and workplace safety. We'll chat about the value of people in every workplace and the critical role of employers in prevention. Narelle, just as a way of an introduction, could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Cameron, I spent about 36 years in public safety, and my background is clearly policing. And I was lucky enough and honoured enough to come and work for WorkSafe just under 2 years ago. It's really energising to come to work every day and know that everybody's here because they want everyone to be safe and they want everyone to go home safely at the end of every day. My daughter's 26. She's the love of my life. She works full time, and I love listening to her talk about what's great about her workplace. And if I hear things that aren't great, I'm like, no, honey, you've got to make sure that you're healthy and you're safe because I want you to come home every night. So I'm really happy to be working for such an amazing organisation that is WorkSafe.
Oh, that's great to hear, and a very important message. It does mean so much to so many people out there. Let's set the scene for today, can we, Narelle? Can you provide a brief snapshot of the economic context in which Victorians are working in 2023?
Absolutely, and it's changed a lot. I'm very old, so I started working way back in the 80s, and 2023 is very different from that. Victoria is a powerhouse of a state, and we're only second to New South Wales in terms of our economic output, and I think that's important that we cater for over 22% of the entire country's economic output. So that just shows how much work is happening in such a small space. In fact, Victoria represents about just over a quarter of all people working in Australia, and it accounts for about $1 trillion in output. So if we put that into comparison with other areas, that's probably bigger than Singapore or New Zealand or even many of the other Asian countries that are around that area. The difference between Victoria and some of the other states is that we're not resource rich in terms of digging things up or, what we actually can produce in terms of, mining or that type of thing. But we're really strong in the intellectual capital. That's our strength, and that's our biggest export. And we see that in education. So international students and education is one of our biggest strengths. And we're seeing a lot of those students coming back to Victoria, particularly after the pandemic, which really impacted on a lot of people. The traditional stuff that was there way back in my youth is still there, and that is your agriculture, your construction and your manufacturing. And I come from an agriculture family, so that's really important. But where once that used to cater for probably more than 20% of the economy in Victoria, we're absolutely seeing a decline in some of those sectors. We're seeing, manufacturing still increasing, and it's a huge economic contributor, over $200 billion annually. I think it's really important to think about what's coming over the horizon for Victoria, for our economy, for our workforce, and how we need to best manage that. So there is some predictions that the population of Victoria is in fact going to double by 2050. So that's going to have a significant impact on food security, construction, particularly if agriculture and those sort of areas are declining. We're all really aware of the big build that's currently going on in Victoria, and that's only going to get bigger with government promises in relation to how many houses are going to be built every day. That's going to mean that a lot of that infrastructure, that equipment, etc., will come into Victoria because we can't dig it up. So that's going to change a lot of how we use our roads and what we're doing. And I think it's also really important to understand our current economic pressures. We've had a pandemic and people are doing it really, really hard. Mortgage rates are going up. The economy is slowly changing, and we need to support those businesses that are doing it tough, and understand that people are having to do things a little bit differently to what they used to do, the way they work, where they work, how they work. So the economy is very different to my youth, and I think it's going to continue to evolve.
Well, thanks for that, Narelle. It's a great overview of exactly what's happening in Victoria. There have been so many changes to the Victorian economy since WorkSafe commenced its operations in 1985. Can you touch on some of these?
Yeah, sure, Cameron. In 1985, WorkSafe was really established on, the construction, the mining, the agriculture, where those physical injuries occur. And we were very comfortable with understanding that physical interaction and how that occurs. We've seen a big change. The technical evolution and those advancements in engineering mean that manufacturing no longer employs, the amount of people that it once did. Things like AI are really going to change what the economy looks like and how our workers engage within that economy. And we've definitely moved towards more of a service orientation type environment. So whilst we used to, produce and build and grow and develop, we're really finding now that we're probably doing more in the service delivery, getting things to people, looking after people, making sure people are great. And we do that mainly in healthcare and social assistance, which we see now accounts for about 14% of all jobs. So if we look at that in numbers, that's like almost 500,000 Victorians are now employed in the provision of healthcare or aged care or childcare, disability services. And we do know that our population is ageing, and we will see that continuing to grow. So there's a significant influx with new workers coming into those service sectors. So potentially people that once worked on the farm, those small farms are changing, and people are now leaving some of those traditional industries and adapting and retraining to fit the economy that we're currently seeing now. I absolutely expect that shift will continue. And I think the next couple of years we'll see a bit of a change in those sectors where we see a lot of new growth and a lot of change. So that's your general services, your health and community services, that financial service information, and the AI is definitely going to make an impact. I think that we're going to really consider the changing environment and the need to be able to have a workforce to meet that changing environment. And the expectations are that there's probably 250,000 people that are going to be needed to fill those roles that we anticipate coming. So the whole of the Victorian workforce is evolving. We need to be aware of what that looks like. We really need to understand the environment that's changing, that it is becoming increasingly complex, and the traditional skill set that people brought into the workforce is also changing. So understanding what that looks like and where potential harms may occur and how we can support people in that role is really, really important.
I wonder, Narelle, if I could get you to expand on this point a little. How has the employment landscape in Victoria changed?
I think COVID really pushed that along the track. So the pandemic saw people working from home, working remotely, much more flexibly, more than they'd ever done in the past. And I don't think that has changed much. People are back at work for some days a week, but people, really expect and want to be able to work remotely and want to be able to work from home. And I think for some employers, that is really complex. How do you protect a workforce? How do you protect an employee that you can't see who's potentially sitting in an environment that you don't control? So I think, during those COVID times, there were people who did the Teams meeting with their business attire up the top and the pajamas below. And that's part of that. How do we understand where the workplace finishes and where does the kitchen or the lounge room or the study actually start? The other thing that's really obvious is that part-time and casual work has significantly increased, as has some of the changes of the work roles available that has resulted in that. So that gig community, or more people taking short-term contracts, even people taking on second and third jobs to try and deal with some of the changes in the economy and the insecure work or the non-traditional contractual arrangements. And that's really concerning for me, because it means that if people are in short-term contracts or in insecure work, it generally means that they're not confident to put their hand up and say, I feel unsafe, or this doesn't feel right, or I don't think that we're doing this the right way, because they're concerned about the security of their jobs. It's really important that we give confidence that they can, or they know where to provide that information, and they know it will be acted on. Victorians changing jobs and industries is happening much more than it probably ever used to. Once upon a time, and in my past life, I stayed in one organisation for 30 years. Now we see more than half of all Victorians are in their job for less than 5 years. And in fact, 20% of our folk have only been in their job for less than 12 months. So less than 12 months, we're still working out about the job that we do and who do we speak to and how it works. And so there's lots to do to build that confidence. The increase in automation and technology, way back in my day when I started, we didn't have computers or mobile phones. So today we see, vastly different skill requirements. And early on in my career, we didn't get sore eyes sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day. But that's something that technology has absolutely changed. So we've got rapidly scaling, emerging industries with new ways of delivering services that really impacts customer behaviour. And I know myself, when I go onto the internet to order something, I expect it almost to come immediately. If I go home and I can't cook, or I don't want to cook, I can ring and the meal will be delivered. So consumers today expect something much different to what they used to do. They expect services to happen. They expect it to be value for money. They expect it to be innovative, and they expect it to be, still service with excellence. So it's a really competitive market. There are significant demands on all people and all players within that market. And the expectations on businesses, I think, has never been greater. There's a real demand. So with the economic uncertainty, there's a real pressure on businesses to find ways to make savings, to be innovative and at the front foot, to be viable, and to be able to, make a wage to ensure that they can live in this economy that's constantly changing. And in addition, with all of those changes, the changing workplaces, the changing expectation of consumers, we really need to have a vision for the change in workplace hazards. And is there an awareness of what that looks like? How do we navigate that in this current economy? And how do we do that better together? Because it's never been harder or more complex, I think.
Well, Narelle, in light of all of this change that you're talking about here today, what are some of the key safety challenges facing Victorian workplaces?
Well, I think the main one is clearly mental injury. And certainly back in my day, we didn't talk about mental injury. We didn't talk about stresses and anxiety or mental illness. And I'm really pleased to say that we're currently in an environment where we absolutely do talk about that. And when WorkSafe was first developed, it was really developed for physical injuries, but it does include psychological injuries. And we are seeing now more than ever that mental injury is a clear and emerging risk to us all in terms of what that does to the insurer that is WorkSafe. So currently, new work injuries that relate to mental injury account for 16% of all claims, but 50% of premiums. So that is really significant. We anticipate that those claims will continue to rise by about 5% every year for the next number of years until the end of the decade. And we're really worried that at the end of the decade, there'll probably be about 30% of all new claims that will relate to mental injury. And mental injury doesn't discriminate. Gender, age, demographic, where you work, it happens to us all. And I see really clear examples of this in the rise in work-related gendered violence, including sexual harassment. And I'm really saddened to say that 1 in 3 people in the workplace have had sexual harassment in the past 5 years. 60% of women in the Victorian working environment have experienced some form of gendered violence at work. And I'm sure those numbers aren't the real reality. I'm sure that the reality is much higher, because we know people don't like to report those sorts of things. But that's more than 1 in every 2 women have suffered in the workplace. And I think that is a really sad and scary figure. And if we look around at our loved ones, my daughter in the workplace, I certainly don't want her to be a part of that. The other thing that I constantly hear and see on the news, etc., is that workplace and aggression. And it's really saddening to see that that's often aimed at the people that are trying to help us most of all. So we see that occurring to nurses, retail workers, police, paramedics who are there to help us, teachers and aged care. Even our own WorkSafe inspectors have suffered that. So I just don't understand why that occurs. Most recently, we noticed the Australian Electoral Commission volunteers working to support the referendum were assaulted by members of the public on both sides of that discussion. So that really saddens me, and that's something I'm really committed to seeing a change in. Also, I think one of the things that has become really evident is the lung disease, silicosis. And I think that there is much more of an awareness in the general community about what that is. The silica dust that gets into the lungs of stonemasons and mining and construction folk, and it takes lives. And, particularly young, healthy men that are in that workplace that suffer from this insidious lung cancer and takes away their life. We've here in Victoria done a lot of work in relation to silicosis, and we've introduced Australia's first engineered stone licensing scheme, and we've really strengthened the regulatory protections and oversight for high-risk work that involves silicosis or silica. But there's a lot more to do, and the reality is we should have seen that coming long before we realised just how bad it was. We should have been on the front foot, and we should have been looking over the horizon. So that's something that we've really learnt from, and it's something that we need to do with other potential issues that are coming our way. As an effective safety regulator, we need to be able to be aware of, identify, respond to the contemporary, the demographic that we're looking at, the environment that we're working in, the economic changes that we've discussed today, and the new emerging challenges that come with that. So on top of all of those emerging things that are coming, what frustrates me most of all, Cameron, is that people are still dying the same way at work as they have been for the past 40 years. And we know that that's occurring in construction. We know that's occurring in agriculture. We know that is falling from heights or being crushed by moving objects or interacting with machinery. It shocks me that there is still machinery out there that's not guarded, or that people take guards off and then people, lose their lives or their limbs. So that really, really saddens me. The highest number of fatalities still are occurring in those known harmful areas: manufacturing, agriculture, and construction. And we know that the most harm that's occurring that isn't fatalities are still your sprains and your strains and your tears. And these are all things that can absolutely be prevented. We know that hazardous manual handling accounts for over 1/3 of all workplace injuries. And I continue to say every time I get the opportunity, every single workplace injury, every single workplace fatality is preventable. None of them should be happening.
I couldn't agree more. And I sense your frustration there, Narelle, but I really appreciate those insights. Broadly speaking, how does WorkSafe keep up with this changing modern economy in Victoria and the health and safety challenges it brings?
We've learned a lot from the past by not getting on top of the silicosis when it came. So we need to ensure that we constantly have an outward focus, and we need to think absolutely beyond our state borders and even beyond our country. So what's happening overseas, we need to be aware of the economy and how that may impact. If the economy falls or is tightened, then people are more likely to take on a second or a third job, and that may impact on fatigue, or they may have a sleep debt that may impact on their safety, or they may not feel safe to put their hand up if they are in short-term work. We need to think about what's happening with industrial trends across the world, and what might the world look like in 20 years' time? Is there likely to be drones flying around delivering our goods? So how do we get on top of that now? We know that climate change is upon us, and we need to understand what the impact of climate change might be. Obviously, climate change will impact some of those really small remote communities and small rural communities. We see already that those communities are declining, and we see people leaving those communities and heading to metropolitan centres where there's potentially more work. We'll see an increase in the demand on our energies, or how we supply our energy. And this is in a time when we're transitioning to renewable energy. So we've got a growing population, we've got continual progression in technology, we've potentially got a population that is moving towards, the city areas and larger metropolitan areas, and country areas that are going to decline. So what does that look like for health and safety? What impacts might that bring? Clearly that will be increased congestion on our roads, increased service demand within our cities. What's happening around the world with similar conditions? What are the workplace safety hazards that they're currently dealing with? And how can we be on the front foot searching or scanning for what's happening across there and what they're putting in place? We also need to consider, the risk to our workers' compensation scheme and what that looks like around the world, and how we can learn from that and bring that back here, because together we need to identify the health and safety risks, and we need to mitigate those risks. We need to learn from others, and we absolutely need to share our information. WorkSafe is probably one of those very unusual organisations where we don't want any new customers. In fact, we don't want any customers at all, because that means that if you're a customer for us, you've been injured at work, you've been affected by a preventable injury or a preventable incident that's caused you an injury. We would much rather prevent than try and deal with someone who's already been injured. We don't want to be caught unawares with other occupational illnesses like silicosis, and we need to be thinking forward. So, we know silicosis is caused from silica, from engineered stone. What does that look like when we get to a time where we start removing a whole lot of, engineered stone bench tops? How do we go about that safely to ensure that people are safe that are doing that? We also need to be smarter with our data, our intelligence and our evidence to really drive a strategic approach, and to understand from the data where the most harm is most likely to occur, at what time and in what industry, so that we can ensure that we're either there before it happens, or we're aware of what might happen, and we put in some mitigation to ensure that it doesn't happen. Our sole purpose, as you know, and I hear you talk about all the time, Cameron, is to reduce workplace harm and improve outcomes for injured workers, and that will never, ever change. But to achieve that, we have to continue to evolve. We need to be aware of what's happening around us locally, nationally, and internationally, and we really need to be a fit-for-purpose, modern, contemporary regulator. But most of all, we need to rely on our people, because it's our people who are the brains trust, who can see what's coming, who can tell us what's happening, and who have often the most solutions to try and prevent the harms.
Well, Narelle, can I pick up on that last point that you make there? Can you touch on the value of people to a workplace and the impact of a strong safety culture?
Absolutely. First of all, let me tell you, when I came to WorkSafe, and I was blown away by how passionate and driven every single employee was. And I had never experienced that in my past life, where everybody was together driving for the one purpose, and that was to reduce harm in the workplace and to get people back to a safe and healthy workplace. And I was blown away, because I'm like, am I drinking the Kool-Aid, or is this exactly what WorkSafe is really like? And after 2 years, I'm really proud to say it's exactly what WorkSafe is like, and what I wish for every other workplace, having that culture where people are so connected to our purpose and what we do, and that ensures that they're really committed and challenged, and they want to do the right thing, and they feel completely supported, and they're happy to put their hand up if they see or feel something that isn't right. And I think of a really recent example where one of our amazing inspectors, he went to a workplace that was just constantly being plagued with work-related violence at a mental health unit. And he went there consistently over 12 months, and it was a really old building. It was a really, the infrastructure wasn't great, but he continued in his dogged response to try and do something to make sure that the people felt safe. He issued improvement notices. He addressed multiple design flaws, and his findings were backed by an independent review. And as a result of that, the employer recruited new staff. They provided additional training, and they changed the system, the duress system, and they closed some of the building to ensure that it was upgraded appropriately so that it was fit for purpose and modern. And as a result of that inspector, James, his pure dedication and persistence to achieving the actual goal and passion that he comes to work for every day, he changed that work environment, and he absolutely prevented harm from occurring in that workplace. He couldn't have done it if he didn't feel safe and supported and confident in his own workplace, knowing that, he was doing the right thing and that he would be completely supported by us, the employer. So it reinforces to me the principle that people are an organisation's most important asset. And one person alone can make such a huge difference in any agency. So looking after the health and safety and the well-being of our employees should be our first priority. And you don't have a business if you don't have people. So it's no good having profits if you don't have people, because you can't get the profits. So people before profits, safety before profits. Look after your people and they'll look after you.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that example. A really good point you make about that. Tell us, what can employers do to provide a strong safety culture, and what value does it bring?
I often get asked this question, Cameron, and the first thing I say is be an employer who wants to employ someone that you love. So I think about who employs my daughter. I want my daughter to work in a workplace where she feels safe, where the culture is really inclusive, where she can go to work and be her best self, where she can put her hand up and say if things aren't working out, or if things don't feel right, or if there's things that we can do smarter or we can do better. So I want her to feel like she can contribute to other people feeling safe in the workplace. Having employers who can actually speak up and tell employees what's happening is the greatest resource that any employer can have, and the greatest impact on the reduction of harm in any workplace. Employees want leadership. They want the tone to be set by the top. They want to ensure that there's processes in place or policies that will support the safety and the culture in the workplace. And they want to know that if there is something wrong and they can enact one of those policies, that they'll be followed, that their voices will be heard, that they'll be listened to, and it will be transparent, that they understand what's happening. So it's really important to emphasise that a safety culture can't simply be mandated or codified, but it's actually a living, breathing organism that permeates every part of the workplace through our employees. So through your loved ones and through my loved ones in the workplace. And employees and employers are the custodians of that culture. So the employers have to set the tone. They have to get it right. And they need a highly engaged workforce that's productive and that will thrive as a result of the culture that they set. So practically speaking, there is a lot that employers can do in a workplace. And I know when I can walk into a workplace and I can feel the culture in the workplace. And when you walk into a place where people are happy and thriving, you can feel the energy and I know that their productivity is really great. So for employers to set a culture that's safe, that leads from the front, that's inclusive, that allows us to bring our best self, makes them an employer of choice. They retain the best people, they attract the best recruits, and they become a really productive, valued workplace. The other thing is it's really important that employers get to know who their people are, know what makes them tick, make them feel included and valued. I know the other day my daughter said, oh, Mum, I stayed back because I really wanted to help out because I was doing this job and it was really important and I really wanted to be a part of it. And that shows to me that that workplace has a culture that's really inclusive. She wanted to drive and be a part of what they were doing. So I think the other thing too is understanding if things aren't working, why aren't they working? Are you doing exit interviews? Do you understand what your injuries look like in your workplace? Do you know why they're occurring? Have you consulted to work out why they're occurring? And I'll go on forever, but HSRs, health and safety representatives, are essential in each and every workplace. So please make sure you've got HSRs in your workplace. Consult with them, listen to them, hear what they've got to say, build really strong and healthy relationships with you because they'll tell you what's happening in your workplace. They'll tell you why it's happening. And more often than not, they'll tell you how to make sure it doesn't happen again. But importantly, there's a legal obligation under the OH&S Act to protect the wellbeing of your people and to consult with your HSRs. So my advice to all employers is really quite simple. Invest in your people, the wellbeing, the health and safety, the engagement, build a workforce, build an employment environment where you would be proud for your loved ones to work in, where people want to come to work every day and they want to grow and be the very best that they can be, because that's going to benefit you as an employer. That's going to benefit the community. You're going to get greater productivity. You're going to get greater economy. And you're going to get greater communities. It's just win-win-win.
Certainly is, Narelle. I couldn't agree more with you there. Really appreciating everything you're saying. We've got a heap of questions coming through. I'd love to get to those if I could. Thank you to everyone who is entering it in the Q&A box on your screen. A lot of people asking this one, Narelle, and you touched on it at the start of your presentation. Working from home is here. Does WorkSafe consider home to be a workplace? And what happens in the event of a notifiable incident?
So absolutely, if you're working from home and that's where you're supposed to be working and you're undertaking work related, then you are in a workplace. And if there is a notifiable incident, then it must be reported. People are working from home more than often now than what they are actually working in a workplace. And we really need to be conscious to ensure that we're setting up those home offices that are correctly set up, that we know where people are. And the other thing is that when you're working from home, you should be working from home. You shouldn't be working from home and trying to care for a loved one or trying to do something else, because you can't do both really, really well. So if you're working from home, then home is a workplace, and employers have an obligation to make sure that you're safe in that workplace, and they absolutely have an obligation to report any notifiable incidents that occur whilst you're working in that workplace.
Okay, thanks, Narelle. This one again, a lot of people wanting an answer to this. How do you see the proposed psychosocial amendments to the Act affecting this transformation?
So the psychosocial regs are currently sitting with government, and I don't know what they look like, so I can't answer that. But what I can say to you is that the protection for psychosocial harms isn't new. Section 5 of the Act provides for both physical and psychological health and wellbeing. So employers currently today and always have had the obligation to ensure that their workers are not just physically well and healthy, but also psychologically healthy. And in fact, you will have seen in recent times some prosecutions that WorkSafe have undertaken in relation to bullying or behaviours where psychological harm has occurred. The psychological regs that are proposed will strengthen some of that support around what's required, but ultimately the requirement is still absolutely obligated in the Act for both physical and psychological health, and that's not going to change. That's only going to get stronger.
Narelle, just a clarification one on that topic. A few people wanting to know, when will the new psychosocial legislation be released?
I wish I knew. That's a matter for government. So I know that consultation went out in March and government are still looking at that. So as soon as I know, I promise I'll let everybody know, but I just don't know. That's a matter for government.
Okay, thank you for that, Narelle. Again, a number of people wanting this one. How do you maintain or build a safety culture within a workforce that is constantly changing, including part-time, casual workers, and people working from home?
So I think it's really important that we have proper induction, training, and people know who they are working with and what's going on. So having that constant reach in, touching base, checking in on people, ensuring that you've got some knowledge of what they're working on, what their workload is like, checking in every day, how are they travelling. We generally know when somebody is not right or is feeling a little bit off. So having really open communication and creating that culture that I spoke of before. We know that there's 20% of our employees across the state that have been in a role for less than 12 months. So there's a real obligation on the employer to induct, to train and to supervise and to create that environment where people can speak up and they can say if this is safe or if it's not safe. It's an obligation that's in the OH&S Act. The other thing is ensuring that your HSRs are really active and that you consult with them and meet with them on a very regular basis. They're fairly constant because they tend to be really passionate and they love their role. And that is just a resource that is so valuable. I can't tell you how important it is just to continue to reach in.
Narelle, you've touched on the challenges and the safety around people working in their own homes. This one relates to other people's homes. As the home care / personal support workforce grows, have WorkSafe considered how to regulate worker safety in other people's homes?
So there's some really challenging thinking around that. So clearly with the NDIS and Disability Commissioner, and there's a lot of overlap from a lot of different regulators. The reality is if you are an employee in the Victorian scheme, then your workplace needs to be safe and it needs to be eliminate risks or mitigate them to the best of your ability. And your workplace could be in somebody else's home. It could be in the cabin of a truck. It could be in the cabin of a train. It could be holding a stop sign on the middle of the road. It doesn't matter where your environment is. What matters is that your employer has an obligation to know what the risks are, to eliminate those risks or to reduce them as is most reasonably practicable, regardless of what the actual environment looks like that you're working in.
Narelle, you touched on the multiple jobs and the changing workforce in your presentation, and this one relates to that. If people are now working multiple jobs, it is likely that they will have many stresses. How do we manage this when stressors are not specific to our workplace?
And this is a question that comes up quite a lot, because we know that 1 in 4 Australians will at some time suffer some sort of mental illness. And we know that we spend, a third of our life in the workplace. So it makes sense that there will be some crossover. This is about knowing our people. It's about understanding what they bring into work, and is your workplace an environment where people can bring their best self, their whole self? Is it a workplace where people can put their hand up and say, I'm not travelling well today, or this is impacting me, or how can we work together through this? And most workplaces now have a great employee assistance program. And so if there is stresses that aren't work-related, I'd really suggest that we encourage people to reach into some of those programs that we have in place. But at the end of the day, the employer needs to understand who is in their workplace and what's happening in their workplace and what the risks are, particularly if it relates to fatigue, understanding if people looking tired, inquiring as to why you're tired. Are you working 2 jobs? Is that a danger for you? Are you likely to be harmed? How can we assist and support you? How do we mitigate that risk? How about we just ask people, how are you travelling? What do you need today? What can I do for you? These are pretty important questions that I wonder whether we are really good at asking, or how often we ask.
That's a good point you make, Narelle. This next one, maybe a chance for a clarification here. I heard a rumour that the OHS Act is being reviewed soon. If so, what will this entail? Will HSRs like me get a chance to give feedback?
So the OHS Act isn't being reviewed as such, although my understanding is that the Minister for WorkSafe and TAC, the Honourable Jenny Pearson, did announce yesterday that there would be a review to HSRs and REO powers, and that would go out for consultation and review over the next 12 to 18 months. It was announced very briefly yesterday, so I'm not across the details. HSRs are the eyes and ears of any workplace. I can't emphasise to employers enough the importance of having them, of listening to them, of involving them. I'm really, really encouraging and supporting of HSRs. And I also want to call out that WorkSafe has a HSR liaison office, so that if you are a HSR and you have got questions, or you're not getting the support in the workplace that you think you should be getting, ring WorkSafe, ring our people. They'll provide individual support for you, advice, and they'll take you on the journey to make sure that we get the outcome that we both want, and that is a healthy and safety workplace. And I know already this year we've helped 90 individual HSRs in that space. And there's also, Cameron, a great podcast coming out on HSRs, their powers, employers' obligations, and how we at WorkSafe and others can support them to be the very best that they can be. There's over 450,000 workplaces in this great state, and WorkSafe simply can't be in them all at any given time or any time. So understanding the importance of HSRs, listening to them, building up their capability, their confidence, and supporting them and backing them in that role is something that WorkSafe is absolutely committed to do.
That's a great message and a great recommendation. There are so many questions coming in. I am conscious of time, though, so I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. I just want to finish on this one finally, Narelle, before we do wrap up. What support can WorkSafe offer to employers, workers, or anyone else who have joined us today to help keep their workplace safe?
We can do so much, and most of it is for free. So come onto our website. We've got the most amazing website. I'm very honoured and privileged to be working with some really talented people, and they've developed a whole lot of guidance or policies, etc., that are all on our website. They're free. Take them, use them, implement them, embed them. We also have an amazing advisory service. Our advisory service will give answers to any questions you might have. And there's also a psychosocial team that works there that can also provide you lots of answers in relation to some of the questions you might have in relation to psychosocial harms. On the website, we also have an amazing program of work called the OHS Essentials Program. And again, for free, go in and have a look. And WorkSafe we have an office in 16 different locations around the state. So there is one near you. We're on the phone, callers. We want to prevent any harm from happening. So we will do anything we can to help and support you before injuries occur, because I want my daughter to come home safe every night, and I want your loved ones to come home safe every night as well.
That's certainly a great message, Narelle, and everyone here agrees. Just quickly on the fact I didn't get to all of those questions there. Sorry about that, first of all. But if people have used their names in their questions, WorkSafe can respond directly to those. If you haven't supplied your name, what I do recommend is to contact that advisory line that Narelle's referring to there. Narelle, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share your insights today.
And thank you, Cameron. I know you've done an awful lot of work in our Health and Safety Month, October, and you're an amazing ambassador for WorkSafe. And I'm really, really thrilled to have this opportunity. So everyone, go well, be safe, look after your loved ones, and look after your employees like they are your loved ones, because they should be. So thanks. Bye, Cameron.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Narelle. We hope that everyone has found this an interesting and informative session. This webinar that you've just been a part of with Narelle will be available online via WorkSafe's website from next month. And remember, as I mentioned, if there is something you want to discuss urgently when you're back at work, there is the WorkSafe advisory line and the emergency line. So please use those. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. Have a great day.